Well, if you could just briefly identify what those ways are, that would be helpful.
So, one way is that concealing requires actually a very strong cognitive effort. By cognitive, I mean the way we think or the way our minds work. So, there's a stress that is involved with concealing because you have to really work hard at this. It's not something that is, if you're lying, it's not that easy always to keep a lie and to keep it certainly for a long period of time. So there is research that has been done about that shows that this is in fact a very difficult type of thing. I know, for example, well, I brought up the example of the military. If you are in the military and you live your life there and you have to talk to your comrades and people talk about maybe it's their girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, and gay people have been known to maybe change a pronoun as a way of monitoring that and say, yeah, my girlfriend. But you really mean your boyfriend. But, this takes a lot of coordination. And, you have to remember what you said the week before. It's all a lie. So people have actually studied this with, in other contexts, as I said. There's a couple of researchers that refer to that. The respondents that they were studying said, this is a private hell. Just the effort of concealing.
The work that's involved.
The cognitive effort. And they describe in great detail the cognitive work that goes into concealing. In this case, it was in the work environment.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? In addition to that, does the person who conceals also lose benefits that he or she might receive if he or she were able to express their true self?
Right. So that's actually another way that concealment is damaging and stressful. So actually, there's several benefits that are associated with that. The first one is that concealing prevents you from what we call, or what people call in psychology, expressed emotion. Expressed emotion is very simply that you're expressing your emotion. But it doesn't have to be any deep emotion, just expressing something about yourself. And that has been shown to be very positive psychologically thing to do. In fact, people have used it as a form of therapy to improve people's mental health. They have used it, for example, in cancer patients, and shown that just writing something about expressing something, but not even very intimate, is very helpful psychologically. So certainly, hiding something and hiding something that is perceived as being at the core about who you are, this is how people talk about. This is who I am. That doesn't mean that gay people are just that. But it is a central identity that is important. And if you want to express who you are, certainly you don't want to hide that part. There's related to that also concept of authenticity, of living an authentic life. And certainly people feel better in an existential way. By just presenting themselves as they are to the world and in interactions with the world.
Does concealment impact a gay man or lesbian's ability to obtain social support?
Exactly. As I mentioned earlier, one of the important mechanisms around stress and illness is the ability of people to cope with stress. And one of the beneficial, one of the beneficial ways people cope with stress is through social support. For example, through having a network of friends that you can talk about, or an intimate friend that you can talk about things. There are also things that happen, though, that happen through for gay people, specifically what we call affiliation with gay community. There are things that maybe you feel, maybe other people don't understand, but if you go to a certain community center or to a center, to an event that is maybe is like a gay pride, that you get certain benefits from being in that environment that maybe you don't get in other places. And certainly if you are concealing your gay identity, you are not going to walk into a gay community center or a gay pride event. And finally, related to that, and especially of concern to me being in public health, in terms of health services, there are many health services that are provided that would provide, I would say, more targeted services to gay and lesbian populations that are more both informed from a medical perspective, for example, about the needs of gay men and lesbians, and also that maybe provide a more welcoming environment. And that too will be something that a person who conceals his or her gay identity would not be able to benefit from. So people are affected by the negatives, but also from the prevention of the positive type of things that they could have had.
All right, now one point I want to clarify here. Can concealment be absolute in nature? Meaning, the person doesn't tell anyone, ever, what their identity is.
I guess it could be. I don't think that, certainly it doesn't have to be that, and I would think that many people, even if they, for example, conceal at work, they might have some friends that they have confided with. There's also concealment that will carry more kind of momentary nature, that is not as long-lasting as I was describing. And that too can have, certainly is not a pleasant experience. Again, because of the notion that you're really prevented from expressing something about yourself that you don't feel that you should. But the reason that you're concealing it is because, again, of the significance of rejection of the region of disrespect that you would feel if you were to reveal this. So it's not just a simple issue.
Well, let me try to clarify the question. I believe there was some testimony from one of the plaintiffs on Monday about knowing that he was gay from a very, very young age, but not coming out, if you will, until he was, I believe, 25. Is that a form of concealment?
It sounds like it. And to the extent that he knew he was gay or he identified as gay at some earlier point and recognized or feared, at least, that if he were to reveal his or express this about himself would lead to, again, rejection, discrimination, to losing maybe a relationship. This is, I presume, what the person expected, and that was the motivation to maybe not to reveal his sexual orientation.
Okay, but alternatively, if somebody, let's say, is open with his family members and friends, but in particular circumstances chooses to conceal or to lie about this, about his orientation, just to avoid having to deal with it. Is that also?
That's another example. As I said, because of don't ask, don't tell, obviously. If you're there, you will have to conceal, but only in that environment. And you might be able to, on home leave, go back and be with your partner or with some friends. Certainly you're not going to want to march in a gay pride parade, so there will be still some monitoring, but it doesn't have to be absolute.
Dr. Meyer, do you see a connection between the concealment process and Proposition 8 in its denial of marriage rights?
Well, again, to the extent that we see Proposition 8 as a part of the stigma, as something that propagates the stigma, it certainly doesn't send a message that it's okay, you can be who you want to be. We respect that. We welcome you as part of the community. It sends the opposite message in my mind, and therefore would, I would think, add to that pressure. to that social environment that encourages people, some people, to conceal. And also, when I talk about those effects of Proposition 8, by the way, they don't only affect gay people. They also send the same message to other people who are not themselves gay. So in this sense, it's not just damaging to gay people because they feel bad about their rejection. It also sends a message that it is okay to reject. Not only that it is okay, that it is very highly valued by our Constitution to reject gay people, to designate them a different class of people in terms of their intimate relationships.
I'd like to show you another example of some testimony from our plaintiffs. This is coming from Kristin Perry testimony that was given on Monday. Again, I'll read it. Question: do you, as you go through life every day, feel that the other effects of discrimination on the basis of your sexual orientation? Answer: every day. Question: tell us about that. Answer: I have to decide every day if I want to come out everywhere I go and take the chance that somebody will have a hostile reaction to my sexuality, or just go there and buy their microwave we went there to buy without having to go through that again. And the decision every day to come out or not come out at work, at home, at PTA, at music, at soccer is exhausting. So much of the time I just choose to do as much of that as I can handle doing in any given day. Do you have a reaction to that testimony?
Yeah. I think that again demonstrates several of the things I've already mentioned, including the expectations of rejection and the need to monitor, and maybe sometimes the need to decide, is it worth it? Do I want to get into this whole thing or just avoid it? But also the repetition of it, like how it really is in so many contexts. But I have to say, the word that most jumped at me in this, it might not be the word that jumped at other people, is the word exhausting. And the reason that it jumped at me is because exhausting has a special meaning in stress research. In fact, one of the earliest examples of stress research was done by a researcher by the name of Hans Selye, S-E-L-Y-E. And he described something that he called the general adaptation syndrome. Now, he studied animals, but his general adaptation syndrome basically echoes what I was just describing. There is a stressor, there is a coping, which he didn't call coping, but it's some adjustment period. But in his words, the end of that was exhaustion. So that was the result of the stress process, was exhaustion. And he studied animals, and in many cases, death of those animals that he studied. So when I saw that, that's kind of what it brought to my mind is Selye's general adaptation syndrome.
All right, let's turn, Dr. Meyer, to the fourth process you described, which you described as internal homophobia. Tell me what you mean by that.
No, so again, that's a word that has been discussed in different forms, but it really relates to the same thing in the different form, that it has been discussed in the literature. As again, I mentioned I used existing literature in terms of homophobia has been something that has been discussed a lot in clinical and psychological research, people who talked about how to treat gay patients. And one of the things they noted is that perhaps a very central aspect of treating people who are troubled by whatever symptom that brought them into therapy is internalized homophobia. Internalized homophobia refers to the person who is gay or lesbian basically internalizing or taking in negative attitudes, negative notions that are existing in society that he or she has learned through their what we call socialization process. through their growing up in our society. And of course, it is not only gay, as I said earlier. Gay men and lesbians who learn those negative attitudes. Those are prevalent attitudes. So, in learning those attitudes, one might learn, if you read this book by Rubin that I mentioned about what gay relationships might be. And then at some age, the person begins to think or realize or recognize, or whatever way this happens, well, I'm gay. So the natural thing is that everything that I've learned about what it is to be gay, that must be what I am. And therefore, if I was impacted by this quote from Rubin, for example, I would say that it will be quite devastating to a young, or really not only young person, if they believe that and thought, well, this is what is in my future.
Well, now, when you use the word internalized homophobia here, do you mean specifically that the person internalizes a fear of themselves?
No, at all. When I use the word homophobia, I use it in the sense of negative attitudes. Maybe something that is akin to racism or sexism. And people use other words, but I use that word because, I have my reasons. I don't know if you want to hear them. It's a word that is recognizable. It's a word that is in the dictionary, and I find it just as good a word as some other words that have been proposed. But it basically relates to the negative attitudes that are prevalent in society about gay men and lesbian, or about homosexuality in general.
Well, now, within the context of internalized homophobia, are you aware of a concept called the possible self?
Yes, I am. And it's not exactly within the, it's again another concept, a theory that I have used, borrowed to explain some of those processes that pertain to internalized homophobia.
What does it mean?
So, possible self is a psychological concept that, again, I did not invent, unfortunately, because it is a very renowned work. And it basically relates to something very interesting. That is that whoever we are, and it really relates to any age, we don't only look at where we are and where we were in our past, but we also project into what we might become. So this is what they call the possible self. What would possibly, could I become, or what are the possibilities for me? Maybe you can talk about it like that. And the work on that showed that this is a very important construct, not only because it actually helps people chart a life course of goals and so forth. It doesn't have to be like super articulated, like a whole life plan. Just, like I mentioned earlier, I will be a mother, things like that. So, the possible self is not only important because of how it projects to the future and how it maybe helps a person think about the future. It is also related to what people think about right now, and having obviously a more optimistic notion of their future will be associated with feeling better about who you are. And the opposite of that feeling, that you will be blocked from achieving goals, obviously, will be associated with what we call a lower sense of well-being, and maybe just negative feelings about who you are and about your position.
And does internalized homophobia lead to a limitation on one's concept of possible self?
Right. I'm sorry. So the relationship is that internalized homophobia speaks very directly to the notion of possible self, because internalized internalized homophobia conveys that there are certain attitudes, certain stereotypes, negative attitudes, that is, in the way that gay people have been portrayed, as I described earlier, related to social stigma, related to cultural portrayal, such as the Reuben, but certainly it is just one example. So if you internalize that, you think, this is who I am going to be in the future. I mean, of course, it is not as simplistic as that, but that part of that is about how do I see my future? How do I see my prospects for the future? Who will I become? And we have seen that actually in some research. Gay and lesbian youth had a harder time projecting to the future because they had learned those kind of negative attitudes. In fact, they have had a harder time. So the very young age children, you know, the most accessible type of possible self, I think, is the kind of family relation that one describes. You know, a very young age, people might, little kids might play and say, I am the wife and I am the mother, things like that. So for gay youth, or gay people, really, at whatever age they begin to grapple with those issues, this is a difficulty. You know, they have to think, well, how would I be, because is it true that, you know, gay, homosexuals are not happy together? You have to begin to, in a sense, undo some of those effects and, in a sense, relearn. And that was part of what the therapists were talking about, to relearn better attitudes about yourself and about what it is like to be gay.
Dr. Meyer, I would like to show you, if we could have demonstrative 8, please, another example of testimony from Monday from our plaintiffs. Again, from Kristin Perry. Question: what does the institution of marriage mean to you? Why do you want that? Answer: well, I have never really let myself want it until now. Growing up as a lesbian, you don't let yourself want it because everyone tells you you are never going to have it. Do you have a reaction to that?
Well, I think that is a perfect example of what I was just describing, where the person recognizing herself, in this case as a lesbian, applies those notions that some of those things that are relevant to other people, such as marriage here, do not apply to me. I can't hope for that. That is not part of my possible self. And I guess she is implying here, presumably because of her being a plaintiff, at some point she began to recognize that, yes, this is something that I could possibly get access to as well. So that's exactly the process I was describing earlier.
Good. I would like to move to your third and final opinion that you referenced earlier, having to do with health outcomes. You have described the stigma attached to being lesbian and gay, and the role of minority stress in the lives of gay men and lesbians. Does that stigma and minority stress, according to the research, have an impact or effect on health outcomes for gay men and lesbians?
Yes.
And what is that impact?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, this entire endeavor, this whole stress process that I described, its purpose is to study health determinants, as we call it, of health, the causes of health and disease. And there's been literally hundreds of studies that study different aspects of this and how it is associated with health outcomes. And we know that for gay men and lesbians and also bisexuals, there has been shown a relationship between experiencing those kinds of stressors and negative health outcomes or adverse health outcomes. In my area of study, those were mental disorders, such as, there are 3 classes that we usually study in community studies. Those are anxiety disorders, mood disorders such as depression, substance abuse disorders. It is classified disorders. There are also just what we would call general distress, or just feeling something, blue and sad, things like that. So there are a variety of outcomes that have been studied. On the other side of it, there's also been health behaviors that are associated with stress, and this minority stress. For example, excess smoking, certain eating behavior, drinking. Again, this is true for the general stress literature, as well as for gay and lesbian populations, with, I guess, the point being that gay and lesbian populations are exposed to more of the stress and to distress, which is unique and additive to the kind of general stress that, as I mentioned earlier, everybody experiences. And therefore that excess risk, as we call in epidemiological language, that excess risk is associated with excess disease or disorder or whatever the outcome is. So I said it could be disorders. It could also be a generalized distress. We have also studied something that's called well-being, which is some people refer to as positive mental health. And there has also been studies that show excess in suicide attempts, in youth in particular.
Okay, Dr. Meyer, does the research show that stigma and the minority stress that you talked about contributes to a higher incidence of these adverse mental health consequences, or the attempted suicide you talked about in the gay and lesbian population, more so than in the population at large?
Yes. So we look at the relationship between excess risk and to see whether it is related to excess in outcome, as we said, of the disease that we are studying. And there have been pretty consistent findings that show excess disorder or higher level of disorder in gay and lesbian populations as compared to heterosexuals.
Okay. I want to be sure we're being clear on a couple of points. Are you saying that being gay or lesbian is in and of itself, in a way, a mental illness?
No, not at all. What I'm saying is that there's risks that is associated with those social arrangement, with the social situation that I described as stigma and prejudice. And that excess risk is related to excess, as we call it, disorder, or to an outcome. It leads to a certain outcome. And because it is excess, it leads to more of the population that is exposed to the risk. But when we study disorders and risk and outcome relationships, it is never expected that everybody who is exposed to a risk is therefore diseased somehow. I mean, even in the area of stress, people who are exposed to the most severe type of stressors, like extreme stressors, we call them, like war, doesn't mean that all of them, therefore, are going to be affected with a disease such as PTSD. What we look at is excess and relationship between populations. As I said before, I studied patterns of diseases. So we want to see, does this population have more of this risk and more of this disease? I don't know if it's clear.
Well, on a related point, I just want to be clear on. Are you saying that all gay men and lesbians suffer from some form of adverse mental health consequences, or that even most do?
No. Again, what we look to see is whether this exposure is related to the outcome among some people. I guess another analogy would be when we look at smoking and lung cancer. So we want to see, do people who smoke have more lung cancer than people who don't smoke? And that would indicate one indication of the association between those two, but it actually is not the fact that everybody who smokes gets lung cancer. going back to the gay and lesbian population, most gay men and lesbians are not disordered. But there is an excess in that population as compared to heterosexuals.
Okay. Do you have a view as to whether the incidence of adverse health consequences of the type that you're describing would be less if we could find a way to reduce the stigma and the minority stress that's experienced by gay men and lesbians?
Yes. I think that it stems from everything that I was saying. When we see people have more of this exposure, they have more of the disorder. And people who have less of the exposure have less of the disorder. So, for example, if we study within a group of, we call them respondent study participants, and we see that some people may have had a lot of those life events, and they were of great magnitude. And then we see that they have more of the outcome that we're studying, maybe depression. And then we see that some other people, for many reasons, didn't have that exposure. Maybe for particular circumstances in their own environment, they were protected from that, or whatever reasons. And we see that they have fewer, a lower level of this disorder. So that indicates that more of those stressors are associated with more of the disease. And by definition, less of those stressors would be associated with less of that disease, or the diseases that are affected by those.
Dr. Meyer, are you familiar with something called Healthy People 2010?
Yes.
What is that?
We actually refer to it as Healthy People 2010.
I said corrected. And what is Healthy People 2010?
Just if you tell people Healthy People 2010, they would probably not know what you're talking about. We just call it Healthy People 2010. Healthy People is a project of the federal government, organized, I guess, I would say led by the Department of Health and Human Services. And it is the plan for the nation's health for the decade that is coming up. So actually, right now, we will be looking for Healthy People 2020. So, Healthy People 2010 is the plan for the health of the nation for the decade that started in 2000, and obviously is ending now.
Could we put up demonstrative 3? Do you have that in front of you, sir?
Yes.
And is this is the text from Healthy People 2010?
Yes, and can I explain something about it?
Sure.
Oh, okay, so Healthy People 2010, the Department of Health and Human Services, and many, this is a very long process that involves, I don't know for exact, but many professionals and researchers and so forth, both in government and outside of government. And so, the main goals that the United States set up for itself in terms of health of the nation, and one of the main goals was to reduce health disparities. Health disparities refer to differences between one population to another population, where one population has more in excess of any kind of disorder, whether it's a mental or a physical disorder. And this is a section from Healthy People 2010 that describes one of those populations, which is a population defined by sexual orientation. And it has identified them as one of our nation's goals to reduce disparities associated with in the health of gay and lesbian populations as compared to heterosexuals. So that's what this is.
Okay, and let me just read, so again the record is clear what you are looking at. It says, sexual orientation, America's gay and lesbian population comprises a diverse community with disparate health concerns. Major health issues for gay men are HIV/AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases, substance abuse, depression, and suicide. gay male adolescents are 2 to 3 times more likely than their peers to attempt suicide. Some evidence suggests lesbians have higher rates of smoking, overweight, alcohol abuse, and stress than heterosexual women. And then we've highlighted the last sentence. The issues surrounding personal, family, and social acceptance of sexual orientation can place a significant burden on mental health and personal safety. In your view, is this finding from Healthy People 2010 relevant to your own opinion as to health outcomes and the relationship to stigma and minority stress?
I think it basically describes what I was talking about today, and this is pretty much what I was describing.
Okay. Can we also show the chart? Do we have a chart? As we're reaching the end here, I just want to put up a chart here which begins with social structure and then has a box on top, coping resources, the top in the middle. And then at the bottom, stress, general and prejudice related, and then on the right, health outcomes, disease. Can you explain what this chart depicts?
This is a very, very schematic, simple way of basically demonstrating the causal chain that I was describing to you today, that goes from the left to the right, with the health outcomes being our outcome of interest. The social structure and social status are here to the left as determinants of stressors that people experience, as well as coping resources. What we mean by that is that stress and coping resources are not randomly assigned to people in society, but they depend on their own social structures. And it can mean something simple as if you are employed, you get fired from your job. But if you are not employed, obviously, you cannot have that kind of event. So events do not just happen in a random order. Specifically, to the topics that I was discussing today, what it shows is that the social status and the stigma lead to exposure to specific stress. Stressors, such as the ones that I described, that I called minority stress. And I described here both general and prejudice related to indicate that everybody experiences general stressors, as I described them, or just plain stress. And then there is added prejudice related stress. And on the top, coping resources relates to what I was describing before as the protective role of coping. And in coping, all this is very simplistic, but there are a lot more behind each of those boxes, as we just discussed at length. The stress, for example. There is a lot more that can be said about coping, for example, and social support is part of that. And it basically shows what we look for is how does this whole process affect health outcomes?
Okay, Dr. Meyer, I want to ask you one last thing as we close here. Do you have a view as to whether the mental health outcomes of gay men and lesbians in California would improve if Prop 8 were not the law of California and gay men and lesbians were permitted to marry?
I do.
What is that view?
I think, consistent with everything that I have said and consistent with my work on the relevance of the social environment, of social structures, and consistent with findings that show that when people are exposed to more stress, they fare worse than when they are exposed to less stress. I think that if California, and consistent with the things I said earlier in terms of the proscriptive elements of Proposition 8, of the law having a constitutional amendment that basically says, to gay people, you are not welcome here, that the opposite of that clearly would send a positive message. You are welcome here. Your relationships are valued. You are valued. We don't approve with rejection, sorry. We don't approve rejection of you as a gay person as a state. And that has a very significant power. As we all know, the law in the state is a very important party to creating the social environment. So clearly, it's not the only thing that determines even experiences of prejudice and discrimination, but it is certainly a very major player, major factor in creating the social environment that I described as prejudicial or stigmatizing.
Thank you, Dr. Meyer. Your Honor, I have nothing further at this time.
Very well, why don't we take 10 minutes, counsel, to get ready for cross-examination. We seem to be falling a little bit behind our schedule, so I'm going to suggest, if it's agreeable with counsel, that we go a bit past 4:30 so we can get in today everything that we had anticipated getting in. Does that sound reasonable?
That sounds great, Your Honor.
Very well, good. Mr. Boies?
Your Honor, to perhaps allay some of the concerns to the court about our pace, as I just explained to counsel for the defendants, we believe that we are on pace to finish Wednesday of this coming week. That is, we believe we will be able to complete our case using tomorrow, Tuesday, and Wednesday.
Okay.
And that is true even if we do not get Ms. Zia today. I told the court that we had hoped to get Ms. Zia in today, but even if we don't get her in today, we're still on target to finish on Wednesday.
That's fine. Is that a suggestion that we not go beyond 4 o'clock?
No, Your Honor, it's not. But I did want, having consulted with counsel for the defendants, I think their cross may very well take us somewhat beyond 4 o'clock, and I just wanted the court to know that we could go longer.
Well, let's just see how far we can get, and if we can certainly finish Mr. Meyer, that would be most helpful, and we can get into Ms. Zia, and that's all to the better, but let's just take it one step at a time.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Cross-examine?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Professor Meyer.
Good afternoon.
You are?
Howard Nielsen for the defendant interveners. I've already put a witness binder on your stand. You should have that, and it should have also been given to the court. And I think we have a couple of witness binders for the opposing counsel as well. Professor Meyer, could you turn to tab 1 of the witness binder?
Yes?
Thank you. And you will find an exhibit there, a document there, pre-marked PX934.
Yes.
Can you identify this document?
Yes, it's a research article by Evelyn Hooker, published, I believe, in 1954 or so.
And are you familiar with this study?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, in his expert report, Professor Heyck said, "This is now considered a classic study in one of the first methodologically rigorous examinations of the mental health status of homosexuality." Are you familiar with Professor Heyck?
Yes.
Do you agree with the characterization of his study?
Can you repeat just the characterization?
Yes, he said, "It is now considered a classic study and one of the first methodologically rigorous examinations of the mental health status of homosexuality."
Yes.
Now, according to Professor Heyck, quote, "Dr. Evelyn Hooker administered a battery of widely used psychological tests to groups of homosexual and heterosexual males who were matched for age, IQ, and education. The men were recruited from non-clinical settings. None of the men was in therapy at the time of the study. The heterosexual and homosexual groups did not differ significantly in their overall psychological adjustment as rated by independent experts who were unaware of each man's sexual orientation." Now, do you agree with that description of the study's results?
Yes.
Is there not some tension between Dr. Hooker's conclusions and your opinions that LGB individuals suffer from a higher prevalence of adverse mental health outcomes than heterosexuals?
Not at all.
Well, please turn to tab 3 in the witness binder, and you will see a document that is pre-marked DIX1247.
By the way, are you moving in 934, or has it already come in?
I'm not sure, but I will ask that it be admitted.
All right, 934 is admitted.
No objection.
And I apologize for not doing that at the first. Okay, Your Honor. Excuse me, Professor Meyer. Now, can you identify this article?
Which exhibit is it?
Tab 3, it's exhibit DIX1247.
Okay, yes, this is my article.
And in fact, it's the same article you talked about on your direct examination, correct?
Correct.
And I happen to hear both defendants and plaintiffs separately designated this. I have my copy in front of me. I will move it into evidence just as an abundance of caution in case.
No objection.
Okay, it came in, however, as plaintiffs.
It's PX 1003, Your Honor.
Fine, thank you. We will refer to it as that.
All right. Now, I would like you to look at page 683 of the article, and that is going by the pagination from the journal that it was originally published in.
Yes, yes.
I'm going to read you just a few passages from this page just to explore your opinions that you expressed in this article. Now, the top of the first column, you write, despite a long history of interest in the prevalence of mental disorders among gay men and lesbians, methodologically sound epidemiological studies are rare. The interest in mental health of lesbians and gay men has been clouded by shifts in the social environment within which it has been embedded. Before the 1973 declassification of homosexuality as a mental disorder, gay affirmative psychologists and psychiatrists sought to refute arguments that homosexuality should remain a classified disorder by showing that homosexuals were not more likely to be mentally ill than heterosexuals. Now, you wrote that, correct?
Yes.
And you believe that that's correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, if you'll skip down to the next paragraph, about the middle of the paragraph, it says, in the social atmosphere of the time. Now, do you see that line? I'm going to read that about the middle of the next.
Yes.
In the social atmosphere of the time, research findings were interpreted by gay affirmative researchers conservatively so as not to erroneously suggest that lesbians and gay men had a higher prevalences of disorder. Now, again, you wrote that, is that correct?
Yes.
And you agree with that?
I wrote the entire article.
Okay. And you're different from some of the professors that I had.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't mean
No,
to.
it's all right, it's all right. And then, now at the bottom of that paragraph, it says, thus, most reviewers have concluded that research evidence has conclusively shown that homosexuals did not have abnormally elevated psychiatric symptomatology compared with heterosexuals. This conclusion has been widely accepted and has been often restated in most current psychological and psychiatric literature. Correct?
Yes.
Now, you believe that this, quote, widely accepted and often restated view is incorrect?
Do I believe that
That this widely accepted and often restated view is incorrect?
Yeah, I believe that it was, as I said. Now, you mean?
No, the view that homosexuals did not have abnormally elevated psychiatric symptomatology compared with heterosexuals. That you said that view is widely accepted and often restated. Do you believe that view is incorrect?
Yeah, I said that it was in the past.
Okay, it was in the past. My question, though, is, do you believe that is incorrect?
Well,
that view?
I have to explain the context of those studies
I'm
because.
sorry, I'm going to move things along. You had a chance to explain your views at length on direct.
Right.
And if opposing counsel thinks it is necessary, you can have an opportunity on redirect. But right now, I really just want to know, yes or no, do you believe that view, that past view, if you will, is incorrect?
I'm sorry. I cannot answer you like that because we are talking about what we call a different generations of studies. And it's just, if I could explain, I would explain. But for example, Evelyn Hooker's study was correct. So if you're asking, do I feel that it was not correct? It was correct, but I don't think that it addressed the question that you're asking me about the prevalence of disorders.
Well, what I'm asking is, do you believe that, in your own words, you said, homosexuals did not have abnormally elevated psychiatric symptomatology compared with heterosexuals? Do you believe that it is correct that homosexuals do not have abnormally elevated psychiatric symptomatology compared with heterosexuals?
I don't believe that as I describe the evidence today.
So you believe that is incorrect?
As of today, yes.
Okay, thank you. And that view is inconsistent with your testimony in this case, correct? Not the view you just expressed, the view that is quoted here.
Right. My view is, my research evidence that is recent has shown that, in fact, gay and lesbian population do have higher rates of some disorders.
So that opinion is inconsistent with what you said was once the widely accepted and often restated view.
Correct.
Thank you. Now look at the next paragraph, the very first line. You say, more recently, there has been a shift in the popular and scientific discourse on the mental health of lesbians and gay men. Gay affirmative advocates have begun to advance minority stress hypothesis, claiming that discriminatory social conditions lead to poor health outcomes. Correct?
Yes.
That's your position, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. And I noticed you use the one of your one of the citations, in fact, after the sentence is to your own work, correct?
Correct.
It says Meyer, 2001.
Correct.
So you consider yourself a, quote, gay affirmative advocate, correct?
Yeah, I'm considering myself a gay affirmative scientist, and I certainly advocate for the improvement of the social environment for gay men and lesbians, yes.
And the exact words you used here were gay affirmative advocates, and you used that in connection with the citation to yourself. So do you believe yourself to be a gay affirmative advocate?
Among other things that I am, such as a social scientist,
So yes, correct?
yes.
All right, thank you. And in fact, you contributed money to the No on 8 campaign, correct?
Yes.
In fact, you did so on 2 occasions, correct?
Yeah, I don't remember, but I did contribute to them because I thought the cause was something that I agreed with.
All right, thank you. And please look at tab number 4. This is something we got off the San Francisco Chronicle's database. It tracked the Proposition 8 contributions. Does this reflect your recollection about your contributions to Proposition 8, to the No on 8 campaign?
I don't have independent recollection, but I don't have any reason to doubt it either, so.
All right, okay, thank you. All right. Now, in your testimony, your writings, and the expert report that I read, I noticed that sometimes you refer to the minority stress model, and sometimes you refer to the social stress model. Now, for purposes of your opinions in this case, are those synonyms?
No.
Are they essentially synonyms for purposes of your opinion here?
Well, one is a case of the other, so they refer to similar theories, but the minority stress per se is the theory that I described earlier, as I described those stressors that are specific to gays and lesbians. But it's the social stress is kind of like a broader category that would fit in it. So I don't know if you want to say that that's a synonym or not, but the minority stress is one of the models that I used as within the, I would say, rubric of social stress.
Well, when we're talking about stress received by disadvantaged groups, would the social stress theory or the social stress model and minority stress model be synonymous?
I think, as I just explained, the minority stress is usually used to the gay and lesbian population. For example, it has things like internalized homophobia or that are specific. But in the social stress, for example, with African Americans, I would say the most prominent article discussed racism and stress, which
Okay,
is parallel, I guess.
So minority stress is a subset of social stress.
Right. But
Okay, thank you. And sometimes you use the word minority stress theory, sometimes you use minority stress model. Is that essentially synonymous?
Yes. Yes, I guess.
Okay, thank you. All right, I just want to clarify that because you use these were different words in some of our articles. I just wanted to make sure that we're on the same page. Now, the social stress model, or if you will, the minority stress model, predicts the individual's the social stress model, or the minority stress model, I guess I should say the minority stress model, predicts that individuals who are members of disadvantaged groups receive more stress than individuals who are not members of those groups, correct?
Yes, and that would be true of the social stress as well.
Okay, so in this case, they are synonyms.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And the model predicts that as a result of social stress or as a result of minority stress, individuals who are members of disadvantaged groups will have worse mental health outcomes than individuals who are not members of those groups, correct?
Yes.
All right. And at least as a theoretical matter, those two premises should apply to other disadvantaged groups, correct?
That, I would say, is a question that is of great interest. But I cannot say correct or incorrect on the way that you described it.
Okay, even as a theoretical matter, you can't say that that's correct?
As a theoretical matter, we look at commonalities and divergences across populations in order to probe our theories and to understand how things work. So there are commonalities as the way that you describe them, yes.
And
There are also dissimilarities, of course. So we try to analyze the balance of those in learning about theoretical issues.
okay. Now I would like you to turn to tab number 8 in the witness binder,
Yes.
and you'll find a document pre-marked DIX 2519.
Yes.
Can you identify that document?
Yes, that's an interview that I was interviewed by this person, David Van Nuys, and I believe it's a transcription of that interview. It was oral, internet radio interview.
Yes, thank you. And in that interview, you discussed some of the studies and the work that you have conducted, correct?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Your Honor, I'd like to move DIX 2519 into evidence.
No objection.
Very well.
Okay, thank you. And I would like to look at the third page of the exhibit.
Yes.
Nope, sorry. I want to look at the second, the bottom paragraph on that page. And it says, so some of the findings that we had, for example, is when we look at stress exposure. So we wanted to study each aspect of this theory because a lot of the elements of the stress theory, especially when it comes to social stress, are often assumed but not tested, and we wanted to test carefully the entire process. So the first hypothesis, it's a pretty big hypothesis, there are a lot of different studies about that, is do disadvantaged groups in fact have more stress? Correct? So that doesn't distinguish gays and lesbians from other disadvantaged groups, correct?
Right. That will be a general test of the social stress model. As you said, the first assumption is the disadvantaged is associated with added stress.
Right. And I would like to go up earlier on that page, your second full response, you say, so around this, I designed the study, and the study included 524 men and women who were New York City residents. And there were people who were in those different groups that we can identify based on this so that we can test this theory. So they were gay and lesbian bisexual versus heterosexual. They were women versus men, and they were black and Latino versus white. And we looked at those three disadvantaged statuses and to what extent those disadvantaged statuses are related to an increase in stressors, as the theory would say, and to what extent, if they do have those increases in stressors, do they in fact lead to certain mental disorders.
Yes.
So at least as a theoretical matter, the social stress theory would predict that for each of those three groups, the disadvantaged group would experience more stress and have worse mental health outcomes, correct?
Correct.
All right, thank you. Now, turning back to LGB, the LGB individuals in particular, you believe that as a result, due in part to minority stress, the LGB population has about twice as many mental health disorders as heterosexuals, including mood, anxiety, and substance use disorders, correct?
Yes.
You also believe that the LGBT population suffers from a higher prevalence of mood anxiety or substance use problems that do not meet criteria for a formal psychiatric order, but are nevertheless indicators of stress, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And you also believe that LGBT individuals have lower levels of well-being than heterosexuals, correct?
Yes.
And you believe that there's a higher incidence of suicide attempts amongst LGBT individuals compared to heterosexual individuals, correct?
Repeat, please.
You believe that there's a higher incidence of suicide attempts among LGBT individuals than among heterosexual individuals?
Yes.
Okay. And where one LGBT individual suffers from minority stress, it would tend to affect the other partner as well, correct? Let me rephrase that. When an LGBT individual is in a relationship, an intimate relationship with another individual, where one LGBT individual suffers from minority stress, it would tend to affect the other partner as well. Is that correct?
I think that's true of all partners. Once something bad happens to one of them, surely it will affect the other.
So it's a yes, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would just say it's not unique to LGB in this case.
Okay, it's not unique, but would it be true?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I assume, it's kind of theoretical. I would assume that it would affect the other person too, who is, if his loved one experienced something.
And specifically, if one of the members of the partnership or of the marriage, whatever it might be, if they suffered one member suffered from minority stress, it would increase general stress on the relationship, and that would have a negative impact on their satisfaction, correct?
Yes, some of these stressors, you know, this is in general kind of an average. So some of those stressors would definitely have this effect. And I particularly studied internalized homophobia as an example of that type of effect. But there might be more minor things that might not have this effect.
Okay, thank you. Now, you believe that the adverse mental health outcomes among the LGB population that you believe you have identified are due, at least in part, to minority stress, correct?
Yes.
Emphasis on due in part.
Well, it's not that I identified all these differences. There are many studies, and even the article that we just discussed, I rely on other studies by summarizing them.
Well, my question is really getting at the...
To the extent counsel is interrupting the answers, he's asking the question, and the witness is answering, and he needs to be permitted to answer.
I'll try to be more careful. I'm just trying to move things along.
All right, but maybe if you could point your questions and the witness could point his answers, hopefully we will meet somewhere in the middle.
I was just making the point that you said that I found those. The evidence about the higher prevalence, and I just made the point that it's not all my studies.
Correct, thank you. And I appreciate you making that clear. Now, my question, though, what I'm really getting at is these mental health outcomes can also result from other causes, correct?
Yes,
And some of those causes would be unrelated to stress, correct?
yes.
And some, even for stress-related causes, some of those stressors would not be related to minority stress, correct?
Yes.
General stressors, I think, is the term that you
Yes.
use, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And those sorts of general stressors are not dependent on membership in a disadvantaged group, correct?
Correct.
All right. Now, at least as a theoretical matter, the social stress model would predict that women experience more stress than men, correct?
It's correct with some. It's correct that we would look for that prediction. Yes.
Okay, thank you. And in this interview, as you described your work, you actually found that men and women did not have different levels of overall stress, correct?
Yes.
And this is something that's also found in the general literature, correct?
Yes.
So regarding gender, the expectations of social stress theory, the disadvantaged group, in this case women, would have more exposure to stress is not verified by your studies, correct?
Yes.
And this expectation, the social stress theory regarding women, is not verified by many other studies either, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. And the social stress model would predict that African Americans and Latinos suffer from a higher prevalence of mental disorders than non-Hispanic whites. Is that correct?
As a group. Yes.
Thank you. Now, in the study that you describe in this interview, you in fact found that African Americans and Latinos do not have more, or excuse me, that they do have more stress than non-Hispanic whites. Is that correct?
Correct.
But you found that African Americans and Latinos do not have more mental disorders than whites, correct?
Correct.
This is a finding that's not unique to this study, correct?
Yes.
This finding seems to be valid because it's been shown with other populations in general studies, correct?
I think other populations, you mean that study the same thing? Other studies, yeah.
Yes. Okay, I was actually just quoting directly from your words here.
Yeah, well, yeah, other studies that use other samples and so forth, yes.
Well, please look at the third paragraph of your first full answer on page 4. And again, we're still in this interview that you gave, and it starts with, however. Can you see that, Professor Meyer?
Page 4?
Yes, your first full answer. It's about the middle of the page. I'm going to read that back to you. You say, however, regarding the blacks and Latinos, we found an interesting finding. And in fact, that just repeats what I just said, so I'm going to skip to the middle.
Okay.
Where it says, so blacks and Latinos have more stress, but they don't have more mental disorders. So that's very bewildering, again, from the social stress perspective, because you question whether your theory is correct. If they have more stress, and the stress is a cause of disorders, which is what this whole study is about, then how come they don't show more disorders, okay? Now, you wrote that, correct?
Yes.
Or rather, you said it probably because it was an interview.
Yeah, right, but probably have written something like that as well.
Okay. And the social stress model would also predict that within the LGB community, African Americans and Latino LGB individuals would suffer from a higher prevalence of mental disorders than white non-Hispanic individuals, correct?
Yeah, I'm sorry. The study that you quoted before was about African American and Latino gay and lesbian people.
Yes.
Are you asking now a difference?
Well, the study you just talked about, you said this was true in the general population as well.
Right. So it's true, but the study that I was conducted was about black and Latino gay men and lesbians as compared to white gay men and lesbians.
All right, and I want you to look at another study you did that's clearly, well, more clearly pointed just at the white, within the LGB group. But I do take your point, so thank you again for clarifying that.
Okay.
But let me ask one clarifying question. The general pattern you said in this article is true for non-LGB as well, correct? For both men versus women and for the ethnicity and race groups?
No, but I would limit it to African Americans versus white because it's a little complicated with Latinos. But yes, African Americans versus white.
Okay, but the social stress model would predict that within the LGB community, African American and Latino LGB individuals would suffer from a higher prevalence of mental disorders than white non-Hispanic LGB individuals. Is that correct?
That was a hypothesis that we tested, yes.
Okay, thank you. And you tested that because that's what the social stress theory or the minority stress theory would predict, correct?
Well, we tested because we wanted to see whether there's actually an alternative prediction too. So it's a little bit more complex than the way you are describing it. But we test the hypothesis because we always pose one side of the hypothesis. In fact, in this matter of gay and lesbian, which we call kind of having dual minority identities, the one theory or one hypothesis that they would have more, because they now have two kind of minority identities or disadvantaged, but the other theory was that they actually would do better because somehow their experience as black exposed them to racism, would somehow give them special coping ability, so that when they deal with the gay homophobia, that they can somehow do better. So those are the two sides, and we certainly posed the hypothesis as one side when we tested it.
Well, two questions. First of all, do you consider that a very parsimonious explanation? And I don't mean your words, I mean as a theoretical matter. Is that a parsimonious theory?
Yeah, parsimonious in what way?
Well, in the way you use it in the social sciences, and you have used that word.
Yeah, exactly, but I have used it in different contexts.
My understanding is that parsimonious means simple, and that in the social sciences, or rather in science in general, a simpler answer is preferred to a more complex one, as long as they both fit the data. Is that correct?
You want me to say that it is preferable in social sciences?
Yes.
There is disagreements about that. So a more parsimonious explanation is preferable if you look to some kind of, in some ways, you are looking for the pithiest and most simple, as you said, explanation that can explain the widest phenomenon. But on the other side of parsimony, there are people, and, a study that... a philosophy of sciences that say that parsimony is not good because it doesn't allow you to understand the details and the workings, that it could oversimplify, in other words. So that is a debatable thing. But certainly we are interested in those questions of parsimony in the way that may be referred to.
Okay.
So we're interested in those questions. We want to see, is it parsimonious? Is it explaining across situation and across populations and so forth? It's certainly what makes my work interesting.
Okay, thank you. Now, please look at tab 9 in the witness binder, and you should find the document that's pre-marked DIX 1253.
Yes.
Can you identify this document?
Yes, that's an article I published in the American Journal of Public Health in 2008.
All right, thank you. And, Your Honor, I would like to introduce DIX 1253 into evidence.
No objection.
1253 is admitted.
Thank you. And this document describes a study that you conducted, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. And please look at the top. There's 3 columns, actually, but look at the first page, the top of the first column, or the second column, the middle column.
Uh-huh.
And now you stated a minute ago that you were You were not inclined to agree with my statement that the social stress theory would predict that black and Latino lesbians, well, LGBT individuals, would have more mental disorders than white non-Hispanic LGBT individuals. But I would like to read that to you, and it says, social stress theories...
I don't think I said that.
Well, do you agree with that?
Can you repeat it?
Okay. The social stress model would also predict that within the LGBT community, African American and Latino LGBT individuals would suffer from a higher prevalence of mental disorders than white non-Hispanic individuals, correct?
Yes, I said that was the hypothesis we tested.
Okay.
So I didn't disagree with that, but I also said that there is a debate, that we try to address in studying this topic. So there is one side and the other side in terms of the dual identity. That's what I was saying earlier. So that was the hypothesis we tested.
Have you completed your answer?
Yes.
Okay. Apologize. Now, the first sentence here says, social stress theories lead us to expect that compared with socially advantaged groups, disadvantaged groups are at a higher risk for mental disorders.
Yes.
So you agree with that statement, correct?
Yes.
So we thus hypothesize, one, that black and Latino lesbians, gay men, and bisexual individuals have more mental disorders than do white, lesbian, gay men, and bisexual individuals because they are more exposed to more stress related to prejudice and discrimination associated with their race and ethnicity.
Correct.
All right. And you believe that that hypothesis followed from the social stress theory, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. And then in the study, you found that African Americans and Latino lesbians, gay men, and in the study, you found that African American and Latino lesbians, gay men, and bisexual individuals did not have a higher disorder prevalence than did white participants, correct?
Than the white lesbian, gay men, and bisexuals.
Correct.
Yes.
And I guess the white non-Hispanic lesbian, gay men, and bisexuals.
Right.
And this finding was contrary to your hypothesis, correct?
Right.
All right, thank you. And you found that African American lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals have significantly fewer disorders than white participants, correct?
I think in some of the findings that was significantly fewer, yes.
Okay, and let's look at page, this first page in the third column, and I will read starting with the second paragraph, the second sentence. It says, contrary to our hypothesis, black and Latino lesbians, gay men, and bisexual individuals did not have a higher disorder prevalence than did white participants. Indeed, black lesbians, gay men, and bisexual individuals had significantly fewer disorders than did white participants.
Right. The black...
Okay, so that is correct.
Yes, but that... yes.
Okay, thank you. And you found that the prevalence of disorders among Latino lesbians, gay men, and bisexual individuals was similar to the... Oh, sorry. You found that the prevalence of disorders among Latino lesbians, gay men, and bisexual individuals was similar to that of white lesbians, gay men, and bisexual individuals, correct?
With the exception of serious suicide attempts, that is correct. But we found them to have a higher prevalence of serious suicide attempts in history.
But not of disorders generally, correct?
Yeah, those three disorders, right.
Okay, thank you. And men and women did not differ substantially in disorder prevalence, correct?
Correct.
So in terms of implications to social stress theory, this study reported inconsistent findings, correct?
Within the context of this particular questions, they were raised in the study, but it is not inconsistent with the general, which I testified to, which was about the difference between gay, lesbian, and heterosexual. So within that gay and lesbian group, there was not the finding that supported the idea that if you had an added minority identity, that will add more disorders to you. But as a group, they had more disorders than heterosexuals.
Correct, but...
Which is not reported here because this is just looking at one particular aspect of it.
But the results regarding race, ethnicity were inconsistent with your predictions made on the basis of social stress theory, correct?
Again, within the context of that, yes.
Thank you. And these results regarding race and ethnicity were inconsistent with other predictions made on the basis of social stress theory as well, correct?
What is it? With other people's? Yes.
Yes, thank you. And he found it notable that the race ethnicity patterns reported here among lesbians, gay men, and bisexual individuals were similar to race differences found among heterosexual individuals in general population studies. Is that correct?
Yes, but again, as a group, they were all elevated. But the differences within the group of gay men, lesbians, were consistent in that sense of that hypothesis that I tested, although there were some differences. But I don't think it's relevant to what you are asking now.
No, I understand that. And you stated that you believe that further research needs to explain the seeming contradiction of social stress predictions, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. We always think that further research is necessary.
Yes.
That's what we do.
That's how you stay in business. And some lawyers predict that litigation is always necessary too, but thank you. Now, the social stress model would also predict that within the LGB community, racial and ethnic minorities would suffer from lower levels of well-being than whites. Is that correct?
Yes, the same rationale.
And the same social stress model would predict that within the LGB community, racial and ethnic minorities would suffer from a higher prevalence of depression than whites. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it is repeating the same thing we discussed because
Well, I just asked you about mental disorders, which I understood to be the subject of the study that we just read. Now I'm asking about well-being first and then suicide attempts second.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So regarding well-being, again, it will be the same basic pattern. You would, on one hand, the social stress part of it would, say, have another minority identity. Therefore, they should have more disorder. The coping, I guess, hypothesis, you can say, would say the opposite. And with regard to suicide, yes, you would expect them to have more.
Okay, so the answer is that the social model, the stress model, would predict that within the LGB community, racial and ethnic minorities would suffer from a higher prevalence of depression than whites.
Yes.
Is that correct? And I apologize, I misspoke. The study I'm going to look at next is about depression and well-being.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Now please turn to tab 10 in the witness binder, and you will find a document that's pre-marked DIX 1252. And can you please identify this document?
Yes, that's another study from the same, another paper that was published from the same study, looking at the different outcomes that you actually mentioned, and it was published in the American Journal of Orthopsychiatry in 2009.
Now, Your Honor, this is also an exhibit that was designated by both parties. I believe the plaintiffs designated it as exhibit number 999, and it may have been among the list that Mr. Dusseault submitted, though I cannot recall.
It is,
Okay, thank you.
and that's in.
It's in? All right, thank you. Now, this document describes another study that you have conducted, correct?
It's the same study. It's a different analysis on the same sample that was in the other paper we just discussed. So it's the same people, but a different outcome, as you mentioned.
All right, so it's the same study, but a different aspect of that study.
Exactly.
All right, thank you. And in this study, you did not find decreased well-being or increased depression in racial ethnic minority respondents as a whole. Is that correct?
Again, those are the gay and lesbian, black, and yes, consistent with what we were just saying with the other study, yes.
Right, and this finding was contrary to your hypothesis stemming from minority stress theory about the added stress that racial ethnic minority status would place on... I'm sorry. And this finding was contrary to your hypothesis stemming from minority stress theory about the added stress that racial ethnic minority status would place on LGB individuals. Is that correct?
Yes.
And your finding regarding mental health and well-being of African American LGB persons is consistent with results of studies of the general population that found that despite greater exposure to discrimination and prejudice, African Americans do not have a higher prevalence of most common mental disorders than whites. Is that correct?
Yes.